At 67, Earl Mercer believed he had lived on the same piece of ground long enough to know when it was trying to tell him something. He knew the south ridge would dry before the creek pasture. He knew cattle crowded beneath the 3 old oaks differently before a summer storm. He knew that when the grass along the north fence began turning coarse before July, the rest of the pasture usually followed within weeks. 38 years of raising cattle had taught him things no manual ever had. But that June evening, an old black notebook made Earl question how much he had actually been seeing. He found it in a wooden cabinet behind the machine shed, underneath a box of rusted horseshoe nails, cracked vaccine syringes, and feed receipts dated decades before Earl had taken over the farm. The cover had gone soft with age. Its corners were worn through to the cardboard. Across the front, "In fadit pengil," were 2 words, "cattle weather." Earl recognized the handwriting immediately. His grandfather's. He carried the notebook into the kitchen and set it beside his coffee. He intended to look through it for 5 minutes. An hour later, the coffee was cold. There were no stories inside, no explanations, just dates, numbers, and short observations. Creek down 2 inches. North pasture slow. Cows walking fences. Hay 61 vales. Sol 14. At first, Earl assumed it was nothing more than an old rancher's record book. Rainfall, cattle numbers, hay inventory. But after several pages, something began bothering him. His grandfather had not only written down what happened when the land became dry, he had recorded things that happened before anyone would have called it a drought. The day cattle began walking farther between bites. The first morning, a grazed pasture failed to show new growth. The day the soil beneath apparently green grass stopped feeling cool, the date cattle began feeding along fence lines they usually ignored until late summer. Earl turned another page, then stopped. One sentence had been underlined twice. No date beside it. No explanation. Just 8 words written darker than everything around them. When grass shortens before creek drops, sell biggest mouths first. Earl read it again. Then once more, sell the biggest mouths first. He knew what his grandfather meant. That was exactly why the sentence bothered him. Outside the kitchen window, nearly 90 cows were spread across the evening pasture. The largest among them were Earl's pride. He had spent decades building those cattle. Long-bodied cows, deep-ribbed, heavy-framed females that raised the kind of calves buyers noticed when they came through the sale ring. Kaw 27, Caw 41, Czoł 63. Animals Earl could recognize from 200 yards away. They represented 30 years of breeding decisions, and now a dead man's handwriting was telling him those should be the first ones to leave. Earl pushed back from the table and stepped onto the porch. June was not even over. The creek still ran over the rocks below the lower pasture. The grass was green. That morning's radio forecast had mentioned storms by the weekend. There was no reason to panic. So Earl did not look at the sky. He looked at the cattle. Several cows were feeding along the north fence. He narrowed his eyes. They usually did not work that edge until much later in summer. Earl walked into the pasture. He knelt and pushed both hands beneath the grass canopy. From the road, the field looked healthy. Up close, the upper leaves were still green, but the soil underneath was warmer than it should have been. And drier. Not dry enough to scare anyone. Just dry enough to make Earl remember another line from the notebook. North pasture slow. He stayed there for nearly a minute, one hand against the ground. The next morning, Earl ran the herd through the old working chute behind the barn. He did not weigh every cow. He did not pregnancy check them. He simply marked 17 animals with yellow livestock paint. The biggest cows he owned, Ray Holloway, whose farm sat 3 miles down the county road, happened to stop by while Earl was separating them. Ray leaned against the steel gate and stared at cow 27, then at 41, then at Earl. "You're selling the wrong cows." Earl said nothing. He looked past Ray toward the pasture. The grass was still green. The creek still had water, and every reasonable sign said there was still time. 3 weeks later, a light rain rattled against Earl's barn roof for less than 20 minutes. By sunset, the clouds were gone. It was the last measurable rain his farm would see for the rest of the summer. Earl had not started with big cattle. When he took over the farm in his late 20s, most of the cows were short-bodied, moderate-framed animals that would never have turned heads at a sale barn. They were plain cattle. They bred back. They raised calves. They survived bad winters. That was about the highest praise Earl's father ever gave them. They fit the place. At 29, Earl thought that sounded more like an excuse than a philosophy. He wanted better cattle. Not cattle that merely survived, cattle that performed. Every fall, Earl hauled calves to the sale barn and stood near the scale while they came through. He watched the numbers. 487 pounds. Wu Bai Ling San. Wu Bai Ling Si. Then another rancher's calves would enter. Wu Bai Sishiba. Wu Bai Sishijiu. Almost 600. Earl never forgot those numbers. In the cattle business, weight was easy to understand. More pounds meant more money. A heavier calf looked like proof that the breeding worked, that the cow was better, that the bull was better, that the rancher had made the right decisions, so Earl started changing the herd. He kept the larger heifers. He culled smaller cows sooner. He bought bulls with stronger growth numbers. Year after year, the cattle stretched out. Longer bodies, deeper ribs, more frame, more weight, and for a long time, the system rewarded him. In wet years, the pastures grew fast enough that feed never seemed like the limiting factor. The larger cows raised larger calves. The larger calves brought larger checks. Those checks paid for new fencing, a used tractor, repairs to the barn roof, a deeper stock pond. By the time Earl was 50, he could walk through the herd and see 30 years of decisions standing around him. That mattered. Cow 27 had the kind of body he had once admired in other men's cattle. Cow 41 had raised one of the heaviest calves on the farm the previous fall. Cow 63 was the type Ray Holloway had pointed at one afternoon and said, "If I had a whole herd built like that, I wouldn't change a thing." Earl had carried that comment for years. The truth was, those cows did more than make money. They told Earl a story about himself, that he had improved the farm, that he had moved beyond the old ways, that he had taken what his father and grandfather gave him and made it more productive. His grandfather's cattle had been noticeably smaller. Earl remembered asking about that when he was a boy. Why not buy bigger cows? Why not keep the heaviest heifers? Why not raise calves like the ranches farther south? His grandfather had looked toward the pasture and said only, "The cow has to fit the land." At 15, Earl had thought the answer was almost embarrassingly simple. At 35, he thought it was outdated. At 67, standing beside the chute with yellow paint in his hand, he was no longer so sure. Cow 27 stepped forward. The steel gate closed behind her. Earl rested one hand on her side. She was sound, healthy, bred. Her feet were good. Her teeth were good. Her body condition was better than several cows he had decided to keep. There was no obvious reason to sell her. That was what made it difficult. If she had been old, the decision would have been easy. If she had missed a calf, easier still. But cow 27 was exactly the kind of animal Earl had spent most of his adult life trying to produce. He looked down at the yellow marker, then at the cow. For years, he had judged cows by what they returned. How heavy a calf, how consistently they bred, how much they brought through the gate. He had rarely asked what the land had to spend to keep them there. Earl drew a yellow mark across her back. The gate opened. Cow 27 moved into the sale pen, then 41, then 63, one after another. The animals Earl had once considered the strongest proof of his progress were separated from the herd. Ray watched from the fence. "You know what bothers me?" he said. Earl kept working. "You're not selling your worst cows." "I know. You're selling the ones you worked the longest to get." Earl stopped for a moment. That was the sentence that hurt, because it was true. He looked at the 17 marked cows, then past them, toward the pasture beyond the barn. For 30 years, Earl had been trying to build more cow, more frame, more weight, more production. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to wonder whether he had spent 3 decades improving the animal faster than he had improved the land underneath it. He opened the next gate, and for the first time in his life, Earl asked a question he had never considered important before. Not, how much can this cow produce? But, how much does this farm have to spend just to keep her here? 2 days after marking the 17 cows for sale, Earl went back to the notebook. This time, he did not read it front to back. He searched for the dry years. 1954, 1955, 1956. The entries were written in the same narrow handwriting, tilted slightly to the right. At first, Earl focused on rainfall. June, light. July, almost nothing. August, worse. That part was obvious. Every cattleman understood drought as a shortage of rain. But then Earl noticed something that bothered him. His grandfather's warnings started before the rainfall totals looked serious. In 1954, 3 weeks before the word drought appeared anywhere on the page, there was a note: South Ridge did not come back. Earl knew that ridge. It was still part of the farm, a higher strip of ground with shallower soil that always dried sooner than the lower fields. He turned the page. Cows staying longer in creek pasture. 2 days later, grass pulling hard. Earl stopped. He understood that when soil still held moisture, plants anchored differently. When conditions turned dry, some areas became easier to disturb, especially where roots were already under stress. His grandfather had noticed that, not as a theory, as a sign. Earl kept reading. Dust behind herd before noon. Shade line full by 10. North field slowing. Then, pond, still good. That line made Earl sit up. The pond still had water. The farm did not yet look like it was in trouble. The cattle were not thin. The creek had not dried. The grass had not turned brown. But his grandfather was already recording stress. Earl turned to 1963. The same pattern appeared. West, flat, slow. Cows crossing early. Creek still running. Then, 1 week later, Solilevi. He turned to 1977. Again, grass, shorter than it looks. Pulled heifers. Sold 9 cows. Rain missed us again. The order was always the same. His grandfather did not wait for the drought to become obvious. He acted when the pasture began answering more slowly. That thought stayed with Earl. For most of his life, he had treated drought as something visible: cracked soil, low ponds, brown grass, dust. But the notebook suggested drought started earlier than that. It started when grazed plants stopped replacing what had been eaten, when cattle changed where they walked, when they searched longer for preferred forage, when shaded ground warmed faster than expected, when one pasture needed more recovery time than it had needed the month before. The next morning, Earl drove to the north paddock. The cattle had left it 4 days earlier. In a normal June, fresh green tips would already be easy to see. Earl got off the four-wheeler and knelt. There was regrowth, but not much. He moved 50 yards and checked again. The same. Then another spot. The same. Nothing dramatic. Nothing a passing driver would notice. From the road, the field still looked green. That was the problem. Earl pushed his fingers through the canopy and touched the soil. It was not powder dry, but it was warmer than it should have been at that hour. He sat back on his heels. For the first time, he understood what his grandfather had been doing. The old man had not been predicting weather. He had been reading response. That was different. Rainfall told him what had fallen from the sky. The cattle and grass told him what the land was able to do with what remained. Earl returned to the house and opened the notebook again. Near the bottom of one page from 1954, he found a line he had missed before. The pencil was faint, almost gone. Don't wait for the creek to tell you what the grass already knows. Earl read it once, then again. Outside, the creek was still running. That morning, the radio still mentioned a chance of storms. Ray Holloway would have called the pasture healthy. So would most people, but Earl no longer looked at the color of the field the same way. Green did not always mean growing. Water in the creek did not always mean enough moisture in the root zone. And a cow that still looked strong could already be asking more from the land than the land was replacing. He closed the notebook. For 40 years, Earl had thought his grandfather kept records of drought. Now he understood. The notebook was really about what happened before drought had a name. The sale barn was already loud when Earl arrived Thursday morning. Steel gates slammed. Calves bawled from the holding pens. Men in dusty caps leaned over railings, studying cattle, the way some men studied cards. Earl backed his trailer toward the unloading alley and waited for the gateman to wave him in. 17 cows stepped down. Big cows. Sound cows. The kind that drew attention for the wrong reason. One buyer standing near the rail watched cow 41 walk past. She open? Earl shook his head. Bred. Bad feet? No. Old? Not old enough. The buyer looked at him. Then why is she here? Earl glanced toward the pen. Cutting numbers. The man frowned, but said nothing else. Ray Holloway was less polite. He arrived 20 minutes later. Coffee in one hand. Say le kettle folded under his arm. He stopped when he saw the yellow paint across the backs of Earl's cows. For a few seconds, he just stared. Then he pointed at cow 63. You're serious? Earl kept his eyes on the pen. Looks that way. Ray stepped closer. That cow raised one of your best calves last fall. I know. And 27? Selling. Susher ye? Selling. Ray lowered his coffee. Earl, if you're short on grass, sell the cows that are costing you money. That's what I'm doing. Ray laughed. No, you're selling your best cattle. The words landed harder than Earl wanted them to, because by every standard he had used for most of his life, Ray was right. Cow, 27 bred every year. Cow, 41 weaned heavy calves. Cow 63 stayed sound and had never needed much attention. They were not problem cattle. They were proof that Earl's breeding program had worked. Ray leaned against the fence. You've got older cows at home? I know. You've got smaller cows? I know. You've got 3 I'd have culled before any of these. Earl finally looked at him. Probably. Ray waited. When Earl did not explain, he shook his head. They're calling for rain this weekend. I heard. Not just a shower. A system. Maybe. Ray looked toward the roof, as if the weather forecast itself had joined the argument. So you're dumping 17 good cows because the grass looks a little short? Earl turned back toward the pen. No. Then why? For a moment, Earl considered telling him everything. The notebook, the years 1,954 and 1,963, the entries about grass recovery, the line about the creek. But standing there beneath fluorescent lights with auction workers shouting lot numbers, it all sounded weaker than it had at the kitchen table. So Earl kept it simple. The pasture is slowing down. Ray stared at him. It's June. I know. The creek is running. I know. The cows are fat. I know. Ray spread one hand. Then what exactly are you seeing that the rest of us aren't? Earl looked through the rails at cow 27. He wished he had a clean answer. He didn't. All he had was a collection of small things. Grass that was not coming back as fast. Soil warmer under the canopy. Cattle spending longer on fence edges. A notebook written by a man who had survived dry years. Earl only knew from stories. None of those things proved a drought was coming. That was the problem. If Earl waited for proof, the decision would become easier. And possibly later, the loudspeaker cracked overhead. Another group of cows entered the ring. Ray took a drink of coffee. If it rains this weekend, you'll regret this. Earl watched cow 41 push her nose between the rails. He almost agreed. There was still time to pull them from the sale, pay the yard fee, load them back up, drive home. No one would blame him. He could wait another week, maybe 2. That was the dangerous thought. Wait until the decision felt safe. Earl remembered the dates in the notebook. His grandfather had sold cattle while the pond was still good, while the creek still ran, while neighbors still believed rain would solve everything. Earl looked at Ray. Maybe I will regret it. Ray raised an eyebrow. Earl nodded toward the cows. But if I'm wrong, I lose some production. Then he looked toward the open loading alley. If I'm right, I keep grass. A worker called Earl's name. The 17 cows began moving toward the sale ring. For 1 second, cow 27 stopped at the gate. Earl felt his chest tighten. Then she stepped through. The gate closed behind her. Ray stood beside him. You sure? Earl watched the yellow marks disappear around the corner. No, That was the truth. He was not sure. He was simply making the decision while it was still his to make. 3 days later, clouds built in the west. Thunder rolled across the farm. Rain began hammering Earl's barn roof hard enough to make him smile. 18 minutes later, it stopped. By morning, the moisture had barely reached beneath the surface. For the next 19 days, nothing else fell. 19 days without meaningful rain changed the way Earl looked at the cows he had left. At first, the difference was hard to see. The pasture had not turned brown. The pond still held water. The cattle were not thin. From the county road, the farm still looked normal. But Earl had stopped trusting appearances. Every morning, he walked through one paddock before breakfast. He checked the places the cattle had already grazed. He watched how long they stayed in certain areas. He paid attention to how quickly they settled down to chew their cud. And after a few days, one thing kept bothering him. The bigger cows seemed to keep moving longer. Cow 52 was a good example. She was not as large as the 17 Earl had already sold, but she still carried more frame than most of the cows remaining. Beside her was cow 18, shorter, more moderate, the kind of cow Earl would once have called plain. One afternoon, Earl watched them from the shade of a hedge tree. Cow 18 grazed for a while, then moved toward the shade and lay down. Cow 52 kept walking. She worked the edge of the paddock, then crossed toward the creek side, then circled back through an area the herd had already grazed. Nothing about it looked dramatic. But Earl began thinking about a simple fact he had spent years ignoring. A cow had to feed herself before she ever raised a pound of calf. Her body came first. Heart, lungs, muscle, digestion, movement, body temperature, pregnancy, milk. All of it required energy, and every bit of that energy came from somewhere. Right now, most of it came from grass that was no longer replacing itself quickly. That evening, Earl sat at the kitchen table with a clean notebook. He drew a line down the middle of the page. At the top of the left column, he wrote, "What she gives." At the top of the right, "What she requires." He started with cow 27, even though she was already gone. Heavy calf last year. Good. Bred every year. Good. Sound feet. Good. Then Earl moved to the other column. Large body. More body to maintain. More forage required before any energy ever reached a calf. He stared at the page. For most of his life, Earl had measured cattle almost entirely by the left column. What came out? Calf weight. Pregnancy. Sale value. He had rarely measured what had to go in. In wet years, that mistake was easy to hide. Grass grew faster than cattle could expose the difference. A large cow could eat more, raise a large calf, and the pasture might still look full a week later. Dry weather removed that cover. Every mouthful now mattered, because very little was coming back behind it. Earl turned to a page in his grandfather's notebook. There was the phrase again, biggest mouths. For years, Earl had taken it literally. Now he realized his grandfather had not been talking about the size of a cow's mouth. He had been talking about demand. The amount of pasture tied up in keeping one animal on the place. The thought unsettled Earl because it suggested something larger. Maybe he had spent 30 years selecting cattle, according to what the market could see, while ignoring what the land had to carry. A buyer could see pounds. A sale barn could see frame. A check could show revenue. But the pasture kept a different set of books. Earl looked out the window toward the herd. He thought about how often he had said a bigger cow was more productive. But productive compared to what? If she raised a heavier calf but needed more forage all year, was she still more efficient? Maybe. Maybe not. The question depended on the land beneath her. That was the part Earl had never seriously asked. The phone rang. "Right. They've got rain south of us." "How much?" "Enough to settle the dust." "That's something." Ray laughed. "You still regretting those cows?" Earl looked at the 2 columns on the table. "No." "Really? Really? You think the smaller ones are going to save you?" Earl leaned back. "No cow is going to save me if I keep more demand than this ground can carry." Ray went quiet. Earl continued. "That's what I missed." "What?" "I kept thinking about how much each cow could produce." He looked at the right-hand column. I never thought enough about how much pasture it took just to keep her standing there. After the call, Earl opened his grandfather's notebook again. Near the bottom of one page, 6 words had been written in faded pencil. Count grass before you count cattle. Earl read the sentence twice. Then he looked through the kitchen window at the herd. For the first time, he understood that the real question was not, how many cows can I own? It was, how many living bodies can this land afford to maintain when the rain stops helping? By the 27th day without meaningful rain, nobody around Earl's county was calling it a dry spell anymore. The land had started changing in ways that could no longer be ignored. The high ground went first. The south ridge faded from green to a dull gray green. Then to the color of old straw, the thinner soils near the fence lines followed. Low ground still held some color. But Earl no longer trusted color. He had learned that green grass could still be grass that had stopped growing. Every morning, he checked the paddocks. The cattle had already left. That told him more than looking at the herd. 9 days after grazing, the north paddock should have shown a fresh layer of new leaves. It did not. The plants were still alive, but they were barely replacing what had been taken. Earl crouched and ran his hand over the clipped stems. That was the part of drought people often noticed too late. Brown grass looked frightening. Grass that stayed green while producing almost nothing was more dangerous because it gave a rancher permission to keep waiting. The cattle noticed before most people did. They began leaving shade earlier in the afternoon. They walked farther between preferred patches. Some started taking rougher stems they normally ignored. A few worked the fence edges where older forage still stood. Earl had read those signs in the black notebook. Now he was watching the same sequence unfold in front of him. It felt less like discovering something new than finally learning a language that had been spoken around him for years. That afternoon, Earl went into the hay barn. He counted every bale, then counted again. He used to think of hay as winter feed, something waiting for December. January, ice, snow. Now he saw something else. Days. Every bale represented time, and every cow represented how quickly that time disappeared. Earl opened his new notebook. Cows remaining, 72. Pasture recovery, poor. Hay inventory, adequate if use stays low. He stopped at the word if. That single word mattered more than the number of bales. If he still had 90 cows, the calculation changed. If he had kept all 17 of the largest cows, it changed again. If the heat held another month, it changed again. If he began feeding hay now, then some of the feed meant for winter would be gone before August ended. The 17 cows he had sold had not produced rain. They had not improved the soil. They had not made the grass grow. What their absence had done was simpler. It reduced the rate at which the farm was being consumed. That gave Earl time. Ray Holloway understood that about a week later, he drove over just before noon. His pickup was covered in dust. The usual grin was gone. "You feeding yet?" Ray asked. "Not much. We started yesterday." "How heavy?" "4 bales a day." Earl said nothing. 4 bales a day in July was not just 4 bales. It was winter feed disappearing in summer. Ray kicked at the dirt near the gate. Dust lifted around his boot. "They're talking about rain next week." Earl looked toward the western horizon. He had stopped building plans around words like maybe, "How many cows you still carrying?" Earl asked. "Most of them." Ray looked toward Earl's herd. Then toward the hay barn. "You've still got reserve." "For now." Ray nodded slowly. A few weeks earlier, he had treated Earl's first sale like a mistake. Now the math was beginning to show, not because Earl had predicted the weather, because he had reduced demand before demand became expensive. Ray looked down the road. "I may have to sell some." "Probably. Prices are softer now." Earl looked at him. There it was. The second cost of waiting. Not only more hay, not only more pressure on pasture, less freedom in the market. When drought spread across a region, ranchers began making the same decisions at the same time. Buy, find water, sell cattle, protect cash. The later a man waited, the more crowded those decisions became. That evening, Earl returned to the 1,954 pages. 3 short lines sat together near the bottom. Sold early. Kept grass. Bought time. He read the last one again. Bought time. That was what his grandfather had understood. He had not sold cattle because he knew the drought would become severe. He sold because he knew certainty arrived late. By the time every pond was low and every pasture was brown, the land would already have taken away most of the good choices. Earl closed the notebook. Outside, the remaining cattle rested beneath the oaks. The pasture was thinner. The heat was worse. The drought was real now, but Earl still had grass. He still had hay. He still had choices. And for the first time, he understood that during a drought, those choices might be worth more than the cattle themselves. For most of his life, Earl had described the farm with one number, 320 acres. That was the number he gave bankers, buyers, neighbors, anyone who asked how much ground he ran. 320 acres sounded solid, permanent, reliable. But by late July, Earl began to understand how little that number actually told him. An acre near the creek still held decent forage. An acre on the south ridge had almost stopped producing. A paddock grazed 6 days earlier had barely recovered. Another had not been touched in nearly a month, yet still carried less usable grass than Earl expected. On paper, they were all acres. On the ground, they were not worth the same thing. One morning, Earl loaded a notebook, a wooden ruler, and a bottle of water onto the four-wheeler. He drove to the west paddock first. From the gate, the field looked better than it was. There was still height, but much of that height came from coarse stems the cattle had already passed over. Earl walked farther in. He bent down, separated the green leaves from the standing residue, then wrote, "West looks better than it feeds." He moved on. The next paddock had rested almost 4 weeks. That should have been enough to make Earl feel comfortable. Instead, the regrowth looked uneven, better in the lower ground, weak on the rise, thin where the soil had already lost moisture. He walked the whole field instead of judging it from the fence. That was another habit. Drought was breaking. A pasture seen from the road could lie. The edges might look green. The low spots might look full. But cattle did not eat averages. They ate whatever was actually there. Earl stood in the middle of the paddock and looked around. Then wrote, maybe 5 days. 6, if careful. Not 8. He stared at that sentence. That was when the farm changed shape in his mind. It was no longer North Pasture, West Pasture, Creek Pasture, South Ridge. It became 5 days, 3 days, maybe 7, 4 if the heat held. Each field became part of a clock. When Earl returned to the kitchen, he spread an old farm map across the table. He wrote estimated grazing days over each paddock. The numbers were rough. He knew that a good rain could change them. Another week of wind and heat could change them the other way. But Earl was not looking for precision. He was looking for a limit. He added the estimates, then compared them with the herd. 72 cows. He went to the hay barn again, counted the bales. This time, he did not write down how many he had. He converted them into days. At 2 bales a day, how long would they last? At 3, what if he had to begin feeding a month early? What if winter came hard? Then Earl wrote another column. What if I still had 89 cows? He did not need to finish the arithmetic to understand the result. The margin disappeared fast. That was when Earl saw the trap clearly. A rancher could believe he was saving cattle in July by feeding hay. But if that hay had been meant for January, he was not solving the shortage. He was moving it forward, borrowing from winter to pay summer. Earl sat back. That bothered him more than the brown edges appearing across the pasture, because it meant a ranch could look stable while becoming weaker every day. Ray stopped by that afternoon. He found Earl at the kitchen table, with the map covered in numbers. What are all those? Days. Ray frowned. Days of what? Feed? Ray looked closer. You're measuring pasture in days now? For the moment, Ray pointed to one paddock. You wrote 4. Maybe 5 if I leave enough behind. Ray shook his head. One storm could make this whole page useless. Earl nodded. Exactly. Ray looked confused. Then why do it? Earl tapped the bottom of the page. Because if the storm doesn't come, I want to know when I lose the right to choose. Ray stopped smiling. Earl looked back at the map. For decades, he had asked how many cattle the farm could carry. That question now felt incomplete. The better question was, how long could the land keep carrying them without being pushed past recovery? That evening, Earl opened his grandfather's notebook. The old line was there again. Count grass before you count cattle. Earl took his new notebook and added his own sentence beneath it. And count grass in days, not acres. When the sky stops paying the difference. He closed the book. Outside, the farm was still 320 acres. But Earl no longer believed that number told him what he owned. What he really owned was time. And every day without rain was spending it. By the middle of July, Earl could tell how bad the drought was becoming by watching the county road. Hay trucks were everywhere. Long flatbeds stacked with round bales moved south in the mornings and came back empty by evening. A month earlier, those trucks had been ordinary. Now people noticed every one. Ray called Earl. Just after 6 one morning. You know anybody still selling hay? Earl looked out the kitchen window. The pasture beyond the house had lost another shade of green overnight. What kind? Anything cattle can eat? That answer told Earl enough. He made 3 calls. The first seller was out. The second said everything he had left was already spoken for. The third still had hay. But the price had climbed sharply since June. Earl wrote the number in his notebook. Not because he needed to buy. Not yet. He wanted to know how quickly waiting was becoming expensive. 2 days later, the price went up again. Nothing about the hay had improved. Demand had. That was the part people missed when they talked about drought. Drought did not only reduce grass, it concentrated decisions. Ranchers who normally depended on pasture began feeding hay in summer. People who had sold surplus hay in spring started trying to buy it back. Some began calling suppliers 50 or 100 miles away. Then, transportation entered the cost. Fuel, time, availability. Every delay narrowed the options. Ray pulled into Earl's yard that Friday afternoon with dust covering the sides of his pickup. I found 60 bales north of town. Earl looked up from the gate. What are they asking? Ray told him. Earl raised his eyebrows. You buying? 30. Only 30? For now. Ray glanced toward Earl's hay barn. You still haven't started feeding much? Not much. Lucky. Earl did not answer. He did not think luck was the right word. 3 weeks earlier, 17 large cows had left his farm. At the time, all Earl could see was what he had given up. Good cows, heavy calves, years of breeding. Now he could see the other side of that decision. He had sold demand. Every cow that left meant less grass consumed each day, less water needed, less hay required if pasture failed, less pressure on every paddock still trying to recover. Earl opened his notebook. He wrote, 17 cows sold. Then beneath it, not just cattle gone, demand gone. He stared at the sentence. Selling cattle usually felt like losing an asset. In drought, keeping cattle also had a price. And that price increased every day. The sky stayed empty. Ray leaned against the fence. Maybe those smaller cows are helping you. Earl shook his head. That's not the lesson. Ray frowned. What do you mean? If I kept too many small cows, I'd still run out of grass. Earl pointed toward the west paddock. If I graze them too hard, I still damage the pasture. Then, toward the hay barn, if I burn through winter feed in July, he still have a problem. Ray looked at him. So what is the lesson? Earl took a moment. The herd has to fit what the land can provide now, not what it provided last year. That was becoming the center of everything. The drought had lowered the farm's supply, so Earl had to lower demand. If he refused, money would have to cover the gap. Hay, freight, water, supplement, eventually, forced sales, and money could disappear faster than rain returned. The phone rang inside the house. A hay seller Earl knew had one last truckload coming through the county. You want me to hold any for you? Earl looked at the numbers he had written that morning. Estimated grazing days, hay inventory, number of cows. He thought about buying simply because hay was getting harder to find. Fear made that tempting. But the numbers did not support it yet. Not this load. You sure? For now. Earl hung up. That was when he realized how much had changed. He was not refusing hay because he believed rain was coming. He was refusing it because his system still had room. Room created by fewer cattle. Room created by earlier decisions. Room created before the whole county began competing for the same bales. Outside, the wind pushed dry heat across the pasture. The drought was taking something from every farm around him. Grass, water, money, patience. But it had not yet taken Earl's ability to choose. And he was beginning to understand that his grandfather had never been trying to protect cattle first. He had been trying to protect that choice. Earl began to think he was ahead of the drought. That was when he made his first serious mistake. The south paddock still carried more grass than the others. Not lush grass. Not enough to make Earl comfortable, but enough to tempt him. He had planned to move the herd after 2 days. On the second evening, he stood at the gate and looked across the field. There was still forage standing. The cattle were not crowding the fence. The next paddock had less reserve than he wanted. So Earl made a small decision. One more day. It did not feel reckless. In a normal year, it would not have mattered much. But this was not a normal year. The cattle took the best leaves first. By the next morning, they had moved lower. They began working into the stems. By noon, some of the preferred patches had been grazed close enough that bare soil showed between plants. Earl saw it as soon as he drove up. The field looked different. Too éfe. Too short. He shut off the four-wheeler and walked in. What bothered him most was not that the cattle had eaten the grass. That was what cattle did. It was how little they had left behind. Earl knelt near a clump that had been bitten almost to the base. The plant was still alive. But under this heat, with this little soil moisture, it had almost no leaf area left to rebuild itself. He stood, then opened the gate. The herd moved out that afternoon. 3 days later, Earl returned. Almost no regrowth. A week later, still very little. The north paddock, where he had moved cattle earlier and left more residue, still held some green. The south paddock looked stalled. Earl walked deeper into the field. The ground felt hotter. Sunlight reached places that had once been shaded by standing grass. The surface dried faster. The difference was not dramatic enough to impress anyone driving past, but Earl could see it. He had taken too much. That evening, he opened his grandfather's notebook and searched for anything that might explain what he had done wrong. There was no long lesson. No diagram. No rule about inches of stubble. Just 2 short entries from another dry year. Moved early. 2 weeks later, grass held. Earl stared at those words. For years, he had thought, moved early meant simple rotation. Move the cattle before a paddock looks used up. Now he understood the reason mattered more than the motion. In drought, the plant needed something left behind. Leaves to capture light, cover to shade the soil, enough living tissue to respond if rain finally came. If Earl kept cattle in one place until they had taken almost everything edible, he was not only harvesting today's forage, he was stealing from the plant's next chance to grow. He took out his own notebook, then wrote, "Fewer cattle do not fix bad timing." He underlined it. Selling 17 cows had reduced pressure, but if Earl used that extra margin to stay longer in each paddock, he could still damage the system. That bothered him because it exposed a weakness in how he had been thinking. He had treated destocking as the solution. It was not. It was only one part of the solution. The other part was restraint, knowing when to leave forage behind, knowing when not to take the final bite, simply because it was still there. Ray came by 2 days later. He looked across the south paddock and nodded toward the thin spots. "Looks like your notebook didn't save that field." Earl did not defend himself. "No." Ray seemed surprised by the answer. "I thought you had this figured out." Earl looked at the ground. "I figured out one part. And this? I stayed too long." Ray looked toward the cattle in the next paddock. "So what now? Move faster. Leave more?" Earl nodded. Ray frowned. "Feels like wasting grass." "It used to." Earl looked back at the south paddock. Not anymore. That was the shift. In good years, standing forage left behind could feel inefficient. In a drought, it became protection. Shade for the soil. A buffer against heat. A little more leaf for recovery. Something between the sun and bare ground. Earl changed the grazing plan that afternoon. Shorter stays. Longer recovery. No forcing cattle to clean up every paddock. He stopped trying to make each field look neatly used. Instead, he wanted it to look unfinished. That took discipline, especially while the drought kept taking more. At sunset, Earl stood at the south gate one last time. The mistake was still visible, but so was the lesson. Surviving drought was not only about reducing the number of mouths, it was also about knowing when the land had given enough and having the discipline to stop taking before it had nothing left to recover with. Earl found the page on a night so hot that every kitchen window was open and the air still refused to move. He had read the 1,954 entries before, several times, but that night, a folded corner near the middle of the notebook caught his attention. The page was yellowed and thin, with a dark smear near the top, where mud or grease had once touched it. Across the first line, his grandfather had written, July 12. 1954. Below it was a list. No story. No explanation. Just cattle numbers, hay counts, and short notes. Earl read slowly. Then he stopped. One number had been circled. Sold 23 cows. 23. More than Earl expected. He ran a finger down the page. Beside the number was another note. Big framed first. Poor keepers next. Earl read it again. That was different from what he had assumed. His grandfather had not simply sold the biggest cattle and stopped. He had reduced demand first. Then he had gone through the remaining herd and removed animals that did not justify what they consumed. The next page continued the pattern. Still dry. Grass holding. 10 days later, neighbors feeding hay. Then, did not replace cows. Earl leaned back. That line bothered him more than the others. He had always imagined the old man destocked during drought, then rebuilt as soon as conditions improved. But when Earl checked the following years, the herd did not immediately return to its old size. The number stayed lower, and the notes changed. There were fewer entries about emergency hay, more about rest periods, more about pasture condition, more about which cows maintained themselves well, more about which animals bred back without extra feed. His grandfather had not treated the 1,954 drought as a temporary interruption. He had allowed it to redesign the herd. Earl closed the notebook halfway and stared toward the dark window. For 30 years, he had asked one basic question: how much can this farm produce in a good year? His grandfather had apparently been asking something very different. What can this farm still carry in a bad one? That difference explained more than Earl wanted it to. A herd built for a wet year could look efficient when grass was abundant. Every extra cow produced another calf. Every extra pound looked like gain. Unused forage felt wasted. So in good years, Earl added animals, kept more heifers, pushed production. He remembered one summer nearly 12 years earlier, when rain had come almost perfectly. Grass reached his knees in some fields. August. Earl had bought additional bred cows because he hated watching forage stand unused. That year had been one of his best. The problem was that those cows did not disappear when the weather changed. They became part of the permanent herd. The farm had slowly been sized around abundance, around rain arriving on time, around pastures recovering quickly, around winter feed lasting exactly as planned. There was almost no margin. Earl looked back at the notebook. His grandfather had left margin everywhere. Fewer cows than the land might carry in a wet year. More standing forage than looked necessary. Hay that remained untouched longer than Earl would have tolerated. As a younger man, Earl would have called that inefficiency. Now he saw something else. Room. Room for heat. Room for missed rain. Room for a bad pasture. Room for a mistake. Room for the land to fail in one place without the entire operation failing with it. At the bottom of the 1,954 page, one sentence had nearly faded away. Earl had to tilt the notebook toward the light. Don't build the herd for the year you hope for. There was nothing after it. No second sentence. No explanation. It did not need one. Earl sat still for a long time. His grandfather had not kept smaller cattle because he lacked ambition. He had not maintained a smaller herd because he failed to understand production. He had built the operation around survival first. Production came after. Earl looked toward the pasture outside. He realized something that hurt more than selling cow 27. His own herd had been designed around the generosity of the weather, not the limits of the land. The next morning, he ran the remaining cattle through the working pens, but this time, he did not look only at size. He looked at age, feet, teeth, pregnancy history, body condition, calf performance, temperament, and how much each cow seemed to demand from the system around her. The notebook had stopped giving him answers. Now it was forcing him to make his own. Earl watched the next cow enter the chute. The question was no longer, which cows should I sell because of this drought? It had become, what kind of herd do I want standing here when the next drought comes? The second sale was harder than the first, not because Earl had fewer cows left, because this time, the notebook did not tell him which ones to choose. The biggest framed cows were already gone. What remained was more complicated. Some were smaller but old. Some bred every year but raised lighter calves. Some held body condition well but had feet beginning to break down. Others were plain, moderate cows that Earl would barely have noticed 5 years earlier. There was no easy category now. No single yellow line to draw across the largest backs. Earl ran the herd through the working chute just after sunrise. He carried his new notebook in one hand. Cow 12 came through first, 11 years old. Still sound enough to travel, but her teeth were wearing down, and the last 2 calves had weaned lighter than the ones before them. Earl marked her. Cow 34 came next. Smaller framed, good feet, but she had calved nearly 6 weeks late the year before, late again this spring. Keeping her meant carrying a cow for a full year whose production was slowly drifting outside the rest of the herd. Earl marked her too. Then cow 18 entered the chute. She was one of the smallest cows remaining. Years ago, Earl might have culled her for that reason alone. Her calves were never the heaviest. She never drew attention. But she bred early, calved without help, held condition better than most through the dry summer. And so far, she had needed no extra feed beyond what the rest of the herd received. Earl opened the gate. No paint. She stayed. Ray arrived around mid-morning and leaned against the fence. You selling again? Yeah. More big ones? Earl shook his head. Ray glanced toward the cows already marked. One was old. Another was narrow through the hips. A third was not especially large at all. Ray frowned. Your grandfather changed his mind? Earl almost smiled. No. Then what changed? I did. Ray waited. Earl closed the chute behind the next cow. The first sale was about cutting demand fast. He pointed toward the marked cows. This one is about deciding what deserves to stay. Ray looked at him. That sounds like the same thing? It isn't. Earl rested both hands on the rail. A small cow can still be a bad cow. A big cow can still earn her place. He looked toward cow 18, standing with her calf. The question isn't size anymore. What is it? Earl thought for a moment. What does she give back for what the farm has to spend on her? That was the question now. Not weight alone. Not appearance. Not even calf size by itself. Earl started looking at each cow as part of the whole system. Did she breed back on time? Could she hold condition without special treatment? Were her feet and teeth likely to last? Did she raise a healthy calf consistently? Was she calm enough to handle? Would keeping her require more purchased feed than her production justified? The drought had changed the meaning of efficiency. Earl no longer wanted cattle that looked impressive in isolation. He wanted cattle that still made sense when grass, time, and money were all limited. By noon, he had marked 11 cows. None of them were terrible. That was what made the decision difficult. In a wet year, Earl could have kept every one, maybe even added more. But he was no longer building a herd around what the farm could carry when everything went right. He was building around what remained when things went wrong. The truck was scheduled for Monday morning. On Sunday evening, Earl walked down to the holding pen. The 11 cows stood under the yellow barn light. Some had been on the farm for most of a decade. Earl remembered which one had calved during an ice storm, which one had broken through a fence as a heifer, which one had needed help with her first calf and never needed help again. They were not numbers. That was why culling always hurt. But Earl had finally accepted something he had resisted for years. Affection did not produce forage, history did not lower feed demand, and keeping every decent cow, simply because she had once earned her place, could slowly make the whole farm less resilient. The truck arrived after sunrise. The 11 marked cows were loaded one by one. Earl watched the trailer door close. He did not feel like he was shrinking the herd. Not this time. He felt like he was defining it. Fewer cows. Clearer standards. More margin. When the truck disappeared down the road, Earl opened his notebook. He wrote one sentence. Keep the cows that fit the land you actually have, not the land you wish you had. Then he underlined it twice. The August sale looked different before Earl even stepped out of the truck. Trailers lined both sides of the gravel lot. Some were backed into unloading alleys. Others waited along the road. Dust hung over the yard in a low brown haze, kicked up by tires, hooves, and the steady movement of cattle. Earl had been coming to that sale barn for decades. He had never seen it this crowded in August. Inside the holding pens, cattle stood shoulder to shoulder. Old cows, young cows, bred cows, pairs with calves at side, animals that, in a normal year, would never have been brought to market this early. The drought had done something simple and brutal. It had pushed everyone toward the same decision at the same time. Sell. Ray was standing near the back rail when Earl found him. He looked tired. Not exhausted exactly, just worn down in the way ranchers looked, when every choice carried a cost. How many? Earl asked. Ray kept his eyes on the pens. 28. Earl turned toward him. That was more than he expected. Which ones? Ray gave a short laugh. The ones I can afford to lose? It was not much of an answer. Earl understood anyway. A month earlier, Ray still had the freedom to sort carefully. Old cows first. Open cows. Bad feet. Poor udders. Weak calves. Now the pasture had taken most of that freedom away. Ray was not shaping the herd anymore. He was reducing pressure. Fast. The loudspeaker cracked above them. A lot moved into the ring. The auctioneer started high. Nobody answered. He dropped. One buyer raised a hand. Another joined. The bidding moved. But not with the energy Earl remembered from June. Then another group entered. And another. Too many cattle. Too many sellers. Not enough urgency on the buying side. Earl watched the board. Some lots still brought respectable money. Others did not. But the direction was clear. When drought forced more cattle onto the market at the same time, the seller's position weakened. Ray saw it too. 3 weeks ago. These would have brought more. Earl did not disagree. Ray looked toward the ring. I should have sold earlier. Earl said nothing at first. He knew how easy that sentence was to say now. 3 weeks earlier, the grass had still carried color. There had still been talk of rain. Hay prices had been lower. The pressure had not yet become obvious. That was exactly why selling early had felt unreasonable. Ray finally looked at him. When did you move those first cows? End of June. Ray shook his head. At the time, I thought you'd lost your mind. So did I. Ray almost smiled. Then, another pen gate opened, and a large group of cows moved forward. He watched them go. Your grandfather knew this was coming? Earl shook his head. No. Then what did he know? Earl looked around the sale barn, at the crowded pens, at the ranchers comparing hay prices, at men who were no longer asking whether to sell, only how much. He knew what happens when everybody waits until they're sure. Ray looked at him. Earl remembered another line from the black notebook. Sell while it is still your decision. He had once thought that sentence was about price. Now he understood it was about control. Sell early. And a rancher might be wrong. Rain might come, grass might recover, the market might improve. There was always risk. But selling early meant choosing which cows left, choosing how many, choosing when, choosing before the pasture became an emergency. When the land ran out of margin, those choices disappeared. The sale barn made that painfully clear. One rancher stood near the office arguing on the phone about hay. Another was trying to arrange water hauling. A third had brought in cows he had raised for years. None of them looked foolish. That mattered to Earl. They were not bad ranchers. They had simply waited for more certainty, and certainty had arrived with fewer options. Late that afternoon, Ray's cattle finally went through. He watched the trailer leave the yard afterward. Should have moved sooner, he said again. Earl looked at him. At the time, You didn't know. Ray nodded. That's the problem. Earl glanced toward the nearly full holding pens. No. He thought about the notebook. That's the whole point. On the drive home, Earl did not feel like he had beaten Ray. He did not feel smarter than the other men at the sale. The drought had humbled him too. He had already made mistakes. He had already learned that fewer cows alone were not enough. But one thing was clearer now than it had ever been. The value of an early decision was not that it guaranteed the right outcome. It preserved the right to choose before the land made the choice for you.